There is a difference between a lawn task that can wait for a free weekend and one that genuinely needs handling this week. And most August lawn advice does not bother separating the two. Some of what your lawn needs right now can sit for a month without much consequence. Some of it cannot. And treating everything on your list with the same casual urgency is exactly how a small, easily fixed problem turns into a much bigger one by the time you finally get around to it. These 5 things belong firmly in the second category, and every one of them has a real, specific reason. The window closes fast this time of year. None of them are complicated or expensive. What separates this list from a general monthly checklist is timing. Since every item here is genuinely time-sensitive in a way that most routine lawn maintenance simply is not. A monthly checklist assumes you have weeks of slack to work with. This list assumes you have days, sometimes less, before a small, easily managed issue turns into something that costs real time and money to fix properly. And that distinction is exactly what makes it worth treating differently from the rest of your usual routine. Quick note before we get into it. Since this is exactly the kind of thing people ask me about constantly, if you're tired of guessing what actually needs your attention right now versus what can wait, I wrote a short ebook that walks you through your specific grass type month by month, so you always know exactly what to do and when. Scan the QR code on screen, or check the link in the description if you want a copy. Now let's get into the list. The first thing worth doing this week, before anything else on this list, is giving the lawn one genuinely deep soak ahead of whatever the next hot stretch actually brings, rather than waiting until the heat has already arrived to react to it. Soil that already holds a good reserve of moisture buffers a plant far better against a sudden spike in temperature than soil that is already running dry when the heat lands, since the roots have something to draw on immediately instead of scrambling to catch up after the fact. This is not the same as your regular weekly watering routine, and it is worth treating it as a distinct, deliberate action rather than folding it into whatever schedule you're already running. Check the extended forecast, and if anything resembling a serious heat stretch is showing up in the next few days, get a full, deep watering down a day or two ahead of it landing, giving the moisture time to actually settle into the root zone before the real demand hits. Waiting until the middle of a heat wave to increase watering means you're always playing catch-up, trying to rehydrate soil that is already fighting an uphill battle against evaporation, rather than giving the lawn a head start it can actually use. The difference this makes is not subtle either. A lawn entering a heat spike with a full reserve of soil moisture typically shows far less visible stress by the second or third day of extreme heat than one that started the same stretch already running dry, since the second lawn is essentially trying to survive on whatever water it receives that same day, with no buffer at all to fall back on if watering gets delayed even slightly. Soil itself acts almost like a reservoir here and a properly deep soak, meaning enough water to actually reach several inches down rather than just dampening the surface. Fills that reservoir in a way a quick daily sprinkle never manages to do. Roots can draw on that reserve gradually over the following days, even if you miss a scheduled watering session entirely, which is exactly the kind of margin for error you want built in before a heat spike arrives, rather than discovering the hard way that your schedule had no slack in it at all. A rough target for this specific soak is somewhere around an inch of water applied in one session, which you can check the same way you would check any watering session by setting a few shallow containers around the yard and timing how long your system takes to fill them to that level. Then running the full soak in one sitting rather than splitting it across several short sessions the way you might for routine weekly watering. The second thing, and one almost nobody actually does, is checking soil moisture directly at root depth rather than judging everything from how the surface looks. A lawn can appear dry and stressed on top while the soil 4 or 5 inches down still holds a reasonable amount of moisture, and the reverse is just as common, a lawn looking deceptively fine on the surface while the deeper soil the roots actually depend on has already dried out completely. Push a screwdriver or a thin garden trowel straight down into the soil in a few different spots around the yard. If it slides in with relatively little resistance to a depth of 6 inches or so, moisture is probably adequate down where it matters. If it stops well short of that, meeting hard, dry resistance only an inch or two down, that is a far more reliable sign you are genuinely behind on watering than anything the surface appearance alone could tell you. This takes about 30 seconds per spot and gives you a direct physical answer instead of a guess based on color, which is exactly the kind of quick practical check that prevents both underwatering and the opposite mistake, dumping more water onto a lawn that did not actually need it. Test in several different areas rather than just one, since soil composition, slope, and sun exposure can vary enough across a single yard that one spot near a shaded corner tells you almost nothing reliable about how a sun-blasted section on the opposite side of the property is actually doing. Keeping a simple mental note or even a quick photo of which specific spots consistently test dry first gives you an early warning map for the rest of the season, letting you catch a developing problem in that exact zone before it ever shows up as visible stress on the surface. A basic soil moisture meter, sold cheaply at most garden centers, does essentially the same job with a bit more precision if you want a number, rather than just a resistance test. But the screwdriver method costs nothing and works just as well for the simple yes or no answer most homeowners actually need, which is whether the root zone is holding enough moisture right now or not. Whichever method you choose, doing it consistently rather than only when the lawn already looks concerning is what actually makes this useful, since the entire point is catching a moisture deficit before it becomes visible, not confirming what you could already see with your own eyes anyway. The third thing worth doing this week is walking the entire lawn once during the hottest part of the day, specifically to map out where visible stress is actually showing up right now, rather than waiting for a Saturday afternoon to notice it in passing. Grass under real moisture stress loses what turf specialists call turgor pressure, meaning the internal water pressure that normally holds each blade upright and springy simply is not there anymore. And the clearest sign of this is what is often called footprinting. Walk across a stressed section and the blades stay flattened where your foot pressed down, sometimes for hours, instead of springing back up the way healthy, well-hydrated grass does almost immediately. Doing this specific walk at the hottest point of the afternoon, rather than in the cool of the morning when even a genuinely stressed lawn can look deceptively fine, gives you the clearest possible picture of exactly which sections are struggling right now today, rather than a general sense of how the yard looked a few days ago. A useful habit here is walking a rough, consistent path across the whole property, rather than only checking the areas you already suspect are having trouble, since footprinting sometimes shows up first in a spot that looked completely fine on your last casual glance, simply because stress had not yet progressed far enough to be visible without actually testing it directly. Grass color shifting toward a dull, slightly blue-gray tone alongside the footprinting is worth watching for too, since that subtle color change often shows up a day or two before the more obvious wilting and browning that everyone eventually notices, giving you an even earlier warning if you know to look for it specifically. The spots that show stress first during this walk are worth remembering for the rest of the season too, since a section of lawn sitting on thinner soil closer to a slope, or catching more reflected heat from a nearby driveway or wall, tends to be the first to struggle every single time a hot stretch arrives. Once you have identified those specific trouble spots, you can start paying extra attention to them specifically during future heat waves, rather than treating the whole lawn as a single uniform unit that all responds to stress identically, which it genuinely does not. Since soil depth, drainage, and sun exposure can vary meaningfully even within a single small residential yard. Getting into the habit of reading these signals directly from the plant itself, instead of relying on a fixed calendar schedule that has no idea what your specific lawn is actually experiencing, is exactly the kind of practical skill the ebook I put together walks you through in more detail. The QR code is on screen now, or grab the link in the description if you want to check it out. The fourth thing, and this one is almost embarrassingly easy to overlook, is actually opening up your irrigation controller and checking whether the runtimes still match what August is currently demanding, rather than whatever settings got dialed in back in May or June. Automatic sprinkler systems are exactly that, automatic, which means they keep running whatever schedule was last programmed into them with zero awareness that the weather has changed dramatically since then. A runtime that delivered plenty of water during a milder stretch of early summer can fall well short once daytime temperatures climb into a serious heat wave. And because the system is still faithfully running on schedule every single time, it creates the illusion that watering is being handled properly when the actual volume reaching the lawn has quietly fallen behind. What the plant now needs, a gap that can persist for weeks without anyone noticing, simply because nothing about the system's outward behavior actually changes. This is exactly the kind of gap that a soil moisture check and a footprint walk, the two things covered just a moment ago, are perfectly suited to catch, since both give you a direct read on whether the current program is actually keeping up, rather than trusting the assumption that a working system is automatically an adequate one. While you have the controller open, it is worth doing a quick physical check of the actual sprinkler heads too, since a system can be perfectly programmed and still underdeliver if a head has become clogged, misaligned, or damaged since the last time anyone looked closely. Run each zone for a minute or two and watch it directly, rather than assuming it is working correctly just because water is coming out somewhere, since a head spraying mostly onto a driveway or a fence, rather than the lawn itself, technically counts as the system running, even though almost none of that water is actually reaching the grass that needs it. If you're running a smart controller that claims to adjust automatically based on local weather data, It is still worth verifying that it is actually doing what it claims rather than assuming the technology has this handled without any oversight. Since a weather station glitch, an outdated local forecast feed, or a setting quietly reverted during a firmware update can all leave a smart system running an outdated program while still displaying a reassuring green light on the app. Trusting automation completely without ever spot checking it against reality is really just a more modern version of the same mistake as never adjusting a manual timer in the first place. The fifth and final thing worth acting on this week, rather than letting slide, is treating any pest or disease damage the moment you actually spot it, rather than waiting to see if it gets worse before doing anything about it. August problems move fast precisely because conditions are already stacked in their favor. Heat stressing the grass at the same time, humidity and temperature are actively favoring whatever fungus or pest happens to be active in your specific region. A small patch of fungal disease can expand from barely noticeable to a genuinely damaged section of lawn within about a week under the right conditions. And grub damage or chinch bug activity follows a similar pattern, starting small and quietly, and then accelerating once the population crosses a certain threshold. Waiting a week or two to see if a suspicious patch resolves on its own, which is the instinct a lot of people default to, usually means dealing with a problem that has had that entire extra week to spread and establish itself more deeply, turning what could have been a quick, cheap, targeted treatment into a much larger recovery project. A quick tug test on the edge of any suspicious patch, checking whether the grass resists or pulls away easily, combined with a close look at whether the pattern is a spreading circle, an expanding irregular blob, or something confined to a straight edge, usually narrows down the likely cause enough to know which specific treatment is actually worth reaching for, rather than guessing and applying something that may not even address the real problem sitting in front of you. Keeping a small handful of common treatments already on hand, rather than needing to make a special trip to a garden center the moment something shows up, removes another layer of delay from this whole process, since even a single extra day spent driving to buy the right product is a day the problem had to keep spreading unchecked. A basic fungicide, something for grub control, and a general insecticide labeled for common lawn pests cover a large share of what typically shows up in August. And having them ready before you need them turns a spotted problem into same-day action, rather than a multi-day project that starts with a shopping trip. It is worth remembering, too, that not everything showing up right now needs an aggressive chemical response. A small, freshly spotted patch of suspected disease sometimes responds well to nothing more than adjusting your watering schedule and improving airflow around that specific area, and jumping straight to the strongest product on the shelf is not automatically the right move just because acting quickly matters. Speed and proportion are both part of getting this right, reacting fast enough to catch the problem early, but calibrated to what the actual severity in front of you actually calls for. It is worth stepping back for a second to understand why this particular week carries more weight than the same 5 actions would in a milder month. Every one of these 5 things is really about catching a problem while it is still small and manageable, rather than after it has had time to compound. And August is specifically the month where small problems compound fastest, since the underlying stress on the plant is already about as high as it gets across the entire year. A lawn dealing with heat stress, a slightly behind watering schedule, and an early unnoticed pest problem simultaneously is fighting on 3 fronts at once, with less spare energy than it has at almost any other point in the growing season, and each of these 5 actions is really just an early warning system designed to catch one of those 3 fronts before it has the chance to genuinely take hold. None of them require expensive equipment or professional help. They require paying attention this week specifically, rather than on whatever day happens to be convenient. There's also a compounding relationship between these 5 items themselves, not just between them and the broader stress the lawn is under. A lawn that already received a proper deep soak ahead of a heat wave, the first item on this list is considerably less likely to show dramatic footprinting during the walk described in the third item, simply because the roots already had the reserve they needed going into the hot stretch. In the same way, a controller that has actually been checked and adjusted for current conditions makes the soil moisture test in the second item far more likely to come back reading fine rather than alarmingly dry. Handling these 5 things together in the same week, rather than picking one and ignoring the rest, produces a noticeably better result than any single item would deliver in isolation. Since a lot of the value here comes from how directly they reinforce and inform each other, each one either confirming that the others are working correctly or flagging exactly where the gap actually sits. If you genuinely only have time to prioritize 1 or 2 of these 5 this week, the soil moisture test and the irrigation controller check are the 2 that give you the most useful information relative to how little time either one takes, since together they tell you almost everything you need to know about whether your current watering approach is actually adequate before you spend a single extra minute reacting to anything else on this list. The deep soak, the footprint walk, and the pest and disease check all matter, but they respond directly to whatever the first 2 checks reveal, So starting there gives every other action on this list a much clearer sense of purpose, rather than treating all 5 as equally urgent. Regardless of what your specific lawn actually needs this particular week, think of the first 2 as diagnosis and the remaining 3 as treatment, and prioritize accordingly whenever your available time is genuinely limited. Exactly how urgent each of these 5 things feels also shifts a bit depending on where you actually live and what kind of August your specific region typically has. Someone in a consistently hot, dry climate is likely dealing with genuine heat stress risk on a near-daily basis throughout the month, which makes the deep soak and the soil moisture check close to a weekly habit rather than a one-time action. Someone in a region that gets a mix of hot stretches broken up by regular rain has more breathing room most of the time, but needs to be more alert specifically around the forecast, since the danger in that kind of climate is usually a sudden, unexpected dry heat spell rather than sustained pressure across the whole month. Someone growing a warm season lawn that is actively thriving in the heat has a genuinely different risk profile than someone with a cool season lawn already sitting in defensive dormancy, since the warm season lawn is spending energy on active growth while the dormant cool season lawn is simply trying to hold on, which changes how quickly each one can recover from a missed watering session or a week of unchecked pest activity. And it is worth keeping that distinction in mind rather than assuming every lawn in every region responds to a missed week in exactly the same way. None of this changes which 5 things matter. It just changes how often you should expect to be running through this exact checklist over the course of the month, with hotter, drier regions and already stressed lawns needing the full routine closer to weekly, while milder regions with healthier lawns can often stretch the same checklist out to every couple of weeks without much added risk. If you're genuinely unsure which category your own region and lawn combination falls into, a good rule of thumb is watching how quickly footprinting shows up after a missed watering day. A lawn that shows visible footprinting within a single day of skipped watering is telling you it has very little buffer built in and needs the full weekly version of this checklist, while a lawn that can go 2 or 3 days without a watering session before showing any real sign of stress has more natural resilience and can likely afford to run this same routine somewhat less frequently. It is also worth mentioning what happens if you skip all 5 of these for an extended stretch, since understanding the actual cost helps make the case for why a few minutes this week is worth the effort. A lawn that never gets a deliberate deep soak ahead of heat spikes spends every single hot stretch playing catch-up rather than starting from a position of strength, which shows up over time as a lawn that always looks a step behind where it should be relative to how much water it has actually received. Skipping the soil moisture and controller checks means watering decisions stay based on guesswork indefinitely, which tends to average out to either chronic underwatering, leaving roots shallow and vulnerable, or chronic overwatering, wasting money and inviting disease, depending on which way a given homeowner's instincts happen to lean, and skipping the pest and disease check simply means problems get caught later rather than never, since they eventually become visible enough that ignoring them stops being an option, just at a stage where the fix costs considerably more time and money than it would have during that first week when the damage was still small and contained. So to bring this all together, give the lawn one deliberate deep soak ahead of the next heat stretch, rather than reacting after it lands. Check soil moisture directly at root depth with a simple screwdriver test rather than trusting how the surface looks. Walk the lawn during the hottest part of the day to map out exactly where real stress is showing up right now. Open your irrigation controller and confirm the run times actually match current conditions rather than whatever was set weeks ago, and treat any pest or disease damage the moment you spot it instead of waiting to see if it resolves on its own. Every one of these takes minutes rather than hours, and handling all 5 this week is the difference between a lawn that coasts through the rest of August and one that spends September trying to recover from problems that were entirely catchable while they were still small. None of this requires turning lawn care into a daily obsession either. It is closer to a short, deliberate check-in once a week during the hottest stretch of the year. The same way you might glance at a weather app before deciding what to wear, just applied to the one part of your property that cannot speak up and tell you directly when something is starting to go wrong. If you want the complete plan for exactly what your specific lawn needs and when, so you're never just reacting after the fact, the ebook I wrote is linked in the description below, or scan the QR code on screen to grab it. Thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next one.